So really appreciate all three of you joining us. Again, I want to welcome Senator Wiener, Assembly Members Chiu, and Assembly Member Ting. That will most likely be the last time that I am super formal. It's easier. I'm probably just going to call you guys Scott, David, and Phil, if that's okay with you. Direct questions that way. I just want to thank the three of you for taking the time out of, things are busy and hectic. And I know for us at the Housing Action Coalition, we thought that maybe sheltering at home would mean that things slowed down a little bit, but we are just busy from morning till night. And so I'm sure the three of you are also. So thanks again for taking the time to have this really important conversation. I think one of the things that we at the Housing Action Coalition have really has really come to fore is that I don't think any of the housing problems that we are seeing now, or I should say it the other way, all the housing problems that we're seeing now pre-existing COVID-19, just think COVID-19 really has brought them to a head and really has brought some of the big issues to the fore that we're thinking about. I think one of the things that we often talk about as staff is the idea of, people are being told to shelter in place, but clearly there's not enough shelter for all people. And so we just think that that is an issue that it's really shown it's brought that issue, I think, more to the top of everyone's mind. So what I would like to do is I'd like to give each of you an opportunity. I'd ask you to take 2 to 3 minutes to kind of talk about the work that you're doing in housing right now, what you see happening or what you hope to be working on when Sacramento reopens, when you see, what you see as a timeline for Sacramento. And Phil, if you want to touch on kind of the budget and kind of, I know it might not be the happiest picture, but if you wanted to kind of talk about that and what that means for affordable housing funding and, and what we'll have to do, that would be great. So I'm just going to start with Senator Wiener. If you want to take 2 to 3 minutes, then I'll move to Assemblymember Chiu and then Assemblymember Ting. Thank you.
Sure, great, Todd. Thank you to you and to the HAC for organizing this town hall. Actually, we were sort of talking among ourselves, hey, we should do a housing town hall, and then the HAC came along and took care of it for us. So we're really happy to be here, and I hope everyone is healthy during this difficult period of time, and I hope everyone is hanging in there. I agree completely that COVID-19 in many ways is laying bare and putting a huge spotlight on some of the problems that we have in California and nationally, and a lot of self-inflicted wounds. It's showing, the lack of a real social safety net in this country, that it's, that it's just every person for themselves, and how just sort of threadbare that safety net has become. It shows the lack of confidence, particularly of our federal government, to actually provide efficient help to people. The fact that it has taken so long, there was a huge delay even in pushing out unemployment and the small business loans and everything else. And so it's laid bare a lot of challenges, and one of them is housing, particularly here in California. And so when we see the disaster that's unfolding with renters not being able to pay rent, and even in a downturn, if they lose their unit, they may not be able to find another place that they can afford to live. We see the crisis of homelessness that we allowed to be created in California by refusing to build enough housing of all varieties, and now that we know that our homeless neighbors are at severe risk for COVID-19 because they are often in congregate settings, in homeless shelters, etc. And we know that our multi-million home shortage in California still exists. And whatever happens with the economy, we're in a recession, we're still going to have a shortage of homes. And even if home prices and rents went down by 20%, because of this recession, when you have apartments renting for $3,000 a month, 20% reduction is something, it's real. but it still means housing is incredibly expensive. And so we need to do the triage right now to make sure that there's a moratorium on evictions, that renters aren't evicted, that when this ends, that people have a way of actually paying their back rent and don't have to pay months of back rent immediately and thus get evicted. We have to work out an equitable way of approaching the landlord-tenant issues that we're seeing. We have to do the triage to make sure that people aren't having their homes foreclosed on, but we have to continue to address the root cause of this problem, which is a profound shortage of housing of every variety. And I know Phil's going to talk about the budget, but if you're in a recession, that's the best time to invest in affordable housing, to keep our construction workforce employed. If the private sector development community has a slowdown, let's keep that workforce employed building affordable housing when it is so cheap to borrow money right now, and to get that housing built. So a lot of work to do. We're going to continue to move our housing bills, SB 899 and SB 902, to allow churches and other nonprofits to build affordable housing on their excess land, and then SB 902 to allow 2, 3, and 4 unit zoning, and allow cities to easily go up to 10 unit per parcel zoning if they want to. So lots of work to do.
Thank you, Scott. And David, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Let me also thank you, Todd, and the Housing Action Coalition, and all of you who are on this call, who I know collectively on this call, we have a lot of brain power and a lot of experience and expertise in how we should be building. And also it's good to see Phil and Scott, two individuals who I'm used to seeing almost every day. And obviously we haven't seen each other in person for 5 weeks, but knock on wood, hopefully we will come out of this soon and be able to continue the work that we've got to do. Let me try to take it from where Scott ended and say a few things. It had been, in the last couple of years in the legislature, housing has finally gotten to the top of the agenda. And in the last few years, there have been a number of important breakthroughs that we've had. But my hope before coronavirus was that 2020 was going to be a year when, first and foremost, we squarely tackled homelessness. And it was also a year where I hoped we continued a very significant affordable housing conversation, and a year when I had hoped we were going to really grapple with what it was going to take to juice production. And COVID-19 has, I think, taken a housing crisis and squared the crisis. I don't think it's even fair to say we've sort of doubled the intensity. We've tripled it, we've quadrupled it on many, many levels. From a homelessness perspective, the fact that we've got 150,000 Californians who, because they don't have roofs over their heads, are most susceptible to COVID-19, to the fact that while we did a ton of work last year around tenant rights, and I want to thank all of you for your support of AB 1482 around just cause protections and rent gouging caps, the fact that we have literally millions of Californians who are barely hanging on right now, and we'll see what happens when the May rent comes due, but things are in a tough place, to the fact that production has really plummeted. And I definitely appreciate that there have been decisions to move forward some level of activity around construction. But I think we all know during this crisis, we've got to continue to build. So we're in a tough spot. But that being said, I'm a big believer in the idea that crisis creates opportunity. And I think that is true for all the areas that we mentioned. So let's take homelessness. The idea that somehow in San Francisco, we, some folks, or statewide could figure out how to house 150,000 folks has seemed really daunting. And literally, I've got bills where we have contemplated, could we set a goal of asking California to house all these folks in 7 years, in 5 years, in 3 years? Well, now we're being forced to do that literally overnight. And we're all grappling to figure out how do we house as many people as quickly as possible. And what I would suggest is, as we do that right now, there will come a point when the curve will flatten. And then we'll be faced with almost a new crisis, but a new opportunity. We will have said, let's try to house all these folks. We'll house a whole number of them. And then we're going to have the question, Do we just say that these folks are going to go out onto the streets again? And I think the answer for all of us is no. But then how do we do that? Creating an opportunity, creating crisis, but creating another opportunity. When it comes to production, I think we all know, it is likely that the level of production that we had hoped to have is not going to be what it needs to be. But what I would posit to all of us is in past economic cycles, when you have an economic boom, you have a housing boom, but when you've got an economic bust, you often see the housing bust. And I think we've got to do everything we can to break that up, to create counter-cyclical support for building housing at all levels of affordability. And I think there are many opportunities to do this, but we're going to have to do things that we've never done before in order to move forward with that. And then I think a third humongous topic we've got to grapple with is what happens in the next couple of months. We have been able, when it comes to tenants and when it comes to homeowners, vis-a-vis evictions and foreclosures. We know that there are going to be folks who can't pay the rent. We know there are going to be folks who can't pay mortgages. How do we ensure that all of these individuals can stay in their homes and do it without bankrupting government and without bankrupting individuals and without bankrupting all the industries that are trying to stay alive right now? That is literally the multi-trillion-dollar question we have. So, my hope is in this next hour, we can start to talk about some of the ideas, but I would also encourage those of you who are listening, if you don't get questions in through chat, feel free to reach out to any of us and know that our respective staffs and I and the members, we are all working hard to figure out answers to some very difficult questions.
Thank you, David. And Phil.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks so much to the HAC as well. Really appreciate everyone for joining us. It's also great to see David and Scott. I'll just kind of pick up where they left off. I totally agree. We have had this huge shortage of housing supply, which is really exacerbating this issue at a time when we're telling everyone to stay at home. If you don't have a home to go into, what do you do? And I think David talked about grappling with homelessness. That was the only issue the governor talked about in his State of the State address. So again, it's something that was definitely a top priority. It was reflected with a budget proposal, about $750 million proposal to grapple with homelessness. Everything that was talked about initially in January is really off the table right now. We're looking on June 15th to pass a budget that will probably be very similar to this year's budget. It might even start containing budget cuts. So in terms of money that we have been able to give to fund homelessness as well as to fund affordable housing, chances are that money won't be there. So I think the question for us is, unlike the federal government, we cannot borrow very easily. But the question is, do we think that we should be passing, one of our various bond proposals that we're looking at to take a look at, building housing, building things, but also to potentially do what David said, which is to potentially put money in the hands of people's pockets as well as in the hands of all the small businesses. This is such a different type of crisis than even what we had in 2008, because every single Californian has been impacted. There's not a single Californian that hasn't been impacted. And so we can't just focus the money for one population or another. We're gonna have to focus and figure out how do we help everybody across the board, especially those that are most in need. I thought Scott brought up a really good point, and this is exacerbating our lack of a safety net. And we're lucky in California, we have more of a safety net than many, many other states. However, it's clear given how expensive things are, it's definitely not enough to cover rent, not to cover food, not to cover basic necessities. So, what are we going to be tackling in the next few months? I think we have a number of bills that have been proposed around housing, around homelessness, that I think will obviously help us with the agenda. I got a bill, AB 828, to have an eviction and foreclosure moratorium in the state during this state of emergency to kind of tackle sort of what David talked about. The one piece it doesn't tackle is the financial piece. How do you help the tenants who can't pay rent? And then how do you help all the property owners who aren't getting rent and help them stay whole? It just helps with the legal procedures. It doesn't help with the financial piece. So that's something that we definitely have to be grappling with. I think when we all started this year, the hope was that we would really be able to do something around supply. I was really lucky to get AB 68 passed to streamline the construction of ADUs, and we were starting before this pandemic hit, starting to see more and more ADUs get constructed. But unfortunately, it was just a very small piece of the supply equation that we needed. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. I think in the budget, there will be a significant discussion around homelessness. I've said publicly what I anticipate is there'll be money for COVID, money for homelessness, and maybe money for wildfires, and probably nothing else. And in August, it's very likely that we may come back and actually do budget cuts. So that's the reality of what we're looking at. We won't really get a clear financial picture till the end of July because we move our tax deadline from April 15th to July 15th. So once we get a clear financial picture, we'll be taking action of either in the positive or in the negative. But again, thanks for everybody for jumping on the call. Like Todd had mentioned earlier, you think like all of us being at home away from all the capital and all the stakeholders to be less busy, but it's actually been busier than ever. So it'll be nice when it kind of gets a little bit more back to normal. But thanks again for organizing the great town hall.
Sure, thank you. So, one of the things that we think about at the Housing Action Coalition on a daily basis of, what is possible today from a political point of view that maybe wasn't possible 60 days ago before this started. And I think that, everyone speaking specifically to and this is just one example, right? We are providing, when I say we, right, people who have been experiencing, certain people who have been experiencing homelessness are being given temporary shelter now, being provided temporary shelter. And, unfortunately, if that does not become permanent shelter, those people potentially would be moved out of shelter back onto the streets, at some point. And what a missed opportunity to keep those people, to make sure that to provide these people with permanent shelter. So it seems like that in some of our conversations with some of our federal electeds, that's top of mind. And so I'm wondering, what do you see things in Sacramento from a legislative point of view? Just what do you see as, do you have top of mind? What do you think is possible maybe to get accomplished today that would not have been possible to get accomplished 60 days ago? And whoever would like to start. Sorry, my other phone's ringing. I'm going to go on mute now.
Well, I think it's probably too soon to say. And there are there's a lot of discussion and predictions about what's going to shift politically or culturally because of COVID-19, what's not going to shift, what's going to be temporary, what's going to be permanent. And right now, I think it's way too soon to predict. I mean, there's a prediction that office buildings are going to become irrelevant. Everyone's going to work from home. We can turn all the office buildings into housing. I do not believe that work from home is going to become some massive transformation in society. I think a lot of people who are working from home right now have seen both the pros and the cons of doing that. So a lot of predictions are happening. Maybe they're going to be true, but we don't know yet. I think in terms of the politics of housing, a few things. First, in terms of the challenges facing renters, I think that has been definitely highlighted when you look at the number of people who, because of the economy we've structured and because of the obscene level of rents, they're one paycheck or two paychecks away from not being able to make rent and not be able to put food on the table if you look at the lines at the food bank. And so I think that we want to be very fair when we're talking about these issues, but I think it really has highlighted some of the challenges we have around renter protections. I believe that this could provide more support for funding for subsidized housing for our lowest income residents. And I think the lack of housing affordable to our low-income residents plays out in terms of some of the health risks that we're seeing now. When people are living in a homeless shelter, we're living 4 families in 1 unit. So you can't, it's really hard to isolate yourself if you think you might have COVID-19 when you're living with 10 other people in 1 unit of housing. And so I think some of those kinds of issues are really coming to the fore. You know, I think the other, in the last few weeks, everyone and their mother has had a hot take on what COVID-19 means for the future of cities and density. And we have, you know, there are some individuals and groups that have said, aha, look, New York City, you know, is so dense, it's the densest city in the country, and it got hit so hard. So therefore, it's all about density. And we have the governor of New York blaming New York City's problems on its density, as opposed to a slow government response by the state of New York and New York City. And of course, it's not true. It's not density, but we're going to hear that argument. We don't need more density because it's going to cause the spread of contagions. We look at some of the densest cities on the planet, like Singapore or Taipei or Hong Kong, which have certainly had challenges with the pandemic, but have been some of the best responses on the planet and have been able to contain COVID-19. Or you look at the second densest large city in the US, San Francisco, whose infection rate is 1/10 the infection rate of Queens, which is the same density. Or you look at Staten Island, which is of the 5 boroughs in New York, Staten Island is the least dense, but has the highest infection rate, whereas Manhattan is the densest and has the lowest infection rate of the 5. So we're going to hear this argument about how density is to blame. There are now more and more studies coming out. There was a study of China comparing different regions and cities of China and density from the World Bank, concluding that density had nothing to do with it. A study out of Germany showed the same thing. If you compare the dense urban areas to the outlying, you know, less dense and rural areas, the infection rates were the same. We have suburbs like New Rochelle, New York, and Kirkland, Washington, and some of the suburbs in Louisiana that have gotten hit extremely hard, and then some dense cities that have not. So just get prepared for this argument, and I think we have to be prepared to respond to it, because you know, if you're not building dense housing in urbanized areas, then you have a choice to have a severe housing shortage or to build sprawl, which leads to more asthma and makes people more vulnerable to respiratory illnesses like COVID-19. But that is a debate that I know will come out of this, and we're on the right side of it.
David or Phil? Yeah.
I would answer the question a little differently and maybe talk about sort of 2 topics. One is homelessness. It's clear that coronavirus, I think, is impacting how we all think about homelessness, which is a topic that for, say, 40 or 50 years in California's history, San Francisco's history, has been one where we all say, you know, we need to grapple with it. There's a lot of hand-wringing, but not a lot has gotten done. And I think the issue has shifted from one of, you know, where are we willing to prioritize it, to understanding that if we don't address it, it not only is a reflection on us and sort of our morality as a society, but it's also if we don't grapple with it, we know it's going to impact all of our health, right? And it's not just the health of homeless individuals; it is everyone's collective health. And so I think there is a moral and a public health urgency to the issue that didn't exist before, that I think will impact what I have been talking about as sort of the 3 major things that we need to do when it comes to housing. One is homelessness. One is we need to fund it better. Secondly, we need to streamline what we're currently doing. And the third is we need to hold ourselves accountable when it comes to tackling that. Let me just take a moment and explain each. We've never as a state established a permanent source of funding for homelessness. And we were looking forward to starting that conversation this year, but I think now it's really going to move forward in earnest. And, you know, Phil talked about the very difficult budget choices we're going to make. Our hope this year was we were going to talk about what fraction of the budget surplus we could put to homelessness. Now, everything's being cut, but I think homelessness still is needs to rise to the top. And I think in addition to that, we should be making other hard choices about how we currently spend money. My colleagues know that for a couple of years, I have been talking about the most expensive housing program in California in our country, which is the mortgage interest deduction. Californians have received $8 to $10 billion a year in multiple tax breaks, which mostly go to the most well-off in our midst. And I think we need to look at reforming the mortgage interest deduction. I'm not proposing eliminating it, but for example, if you were to take 5% of the $10 billion a year we spent on the MID, that is mostly going to individuals that get tax breaks on vacation homes. If we were to take just 5% of that, so $500 million a year, we could make a serious dent in helping to fund homeless services and homeless production around the state of California. Similarly, cities and counties and the state fight all the time when it comes to addressing homelessness. There's a lot of finger pointing. We need to learn all the services. We've got to get everyone to work together. And that's starting to happen now more than it's ever because of the crisis. And then accountability. We need to make sure that every city, every county, every region in the state is doing their part. Because the reality is, even if, say, a city like San Francisco or Oakland or San Jose are striving mightily to address it, we've got all sorts of jurisdictions around us that aren't, and we could do more. And so I do think the questions in homelessness have shifted dramatically. And then I'll just take 30 seconds and say, I mentioned before the importance of thinking counter-cyclically. I think if we didn't have coronavirus, we knew that a recession is inevitable. Whether we would think about the recession as an opportunity to build, I'm not sure it would be as highlighted as it is now. We know with the economy being where it is, land is going to be cheaper, labor is likely going to be cheaper, materials are going to be cheaper, and the need is going to be there. And so it behooves us to build as quickly as we can in the down months, in part because we need the housing, in part because we need to put folks back to work. And I think that means that policymakers like Phil and Scott and I, we want to ask and figure out with all of you, what are the current barriers to making sure that we can put as many folks to work building as many units as possible in the coming months and years.
So just to go back to your original question in terms of what specific opportunities are there. In this year, we are seeing appropriations of about $150 million short-term that Governor Newsom gave to cities and counties to get homeless people off the street right now. And they're getting housed in hotels and motels. So the question is, as we talked about earlier, is what's going to happen to them when the state of emergency is over and we're stopping the payments to the hotels and motels? Are they going to go back on the street? Are we going to start looking at what San Jose did? San Jose has started to purchase hotels and motels and use them as housing for the homeless. I think that's the real opportunity there is, do we see an opportunity to purchase some of these hotel and motels to make it permanent homeless shelters? Part of the major challenge around that is just proper staffing. Obviously, many of these rooms weren't meant for permanent living. They don't really have kitchens, and they're not easily set up where you can deliver food and set up social services. But again, that presents a very unique opportunity that really wasn't there previously, because we actually are, as we speak, moving thousands of people off the street into some type of shelter. People that without this kind of action would still be on the street. So we know that homelessness, again, is going to be part of this budget discussion. A lot of what we have been relying on is really looking to all the cities, the counties, and all the nonprofits and CEOs to design their particular reaction. And so what would love is, again, for HAC, all the different stakeholders out there to give us feedback at how you're seeing that going. Obviously, as hard as it is to build market rate housing, it's even harder to build supportive housing and homeless shelters. So that's something that we have to continue to work on to make it easier to build shelter and to build supportive housing. We know that if we can't get housing for the homeless up, then there's really no permanent long-term solution. Before we had left for our recess, we were actually pretty close to having some understanding about what we might want to do around homelessness. Obviously, everything around COVID has kind of changed that. And so I think that, we're kind of going back to the drawing board, but the need is even more acute because it's not just a housing crisis, it's not just a moral crisis, now it's a public health crisis, because we see that if we don't get people off the streets, these homeless encampments are going to be the #1 place where this virus gets spread. And that's what you've seen throughout time. I mean, you've seen throughout the history of man that, again, you have a situation when there is lack of housing or poor housing, you see viruses spread, that's where they spread. And so again, we have this situation where we know what's going to happen, and we're doing everything possible to prevent it.
Thank you. So kind of a little bit of a follow-up. So, the theme, and I think not surprising, right, where everyone's feeling like perhaps there's an opportunity for kind of, affordable housing, whether that is, low-income housing or whether it is homeless housing. So let's wave our magic wand and let's assume zoning changes, right? You can now build multifamily housing, right, in urban centers, right, in all neighborhoods and urban centers, which I'm sure that wouldn't be controversial at all. And let's say that there's a political will to do it, right? We still need the funding for that. And as you were saying, Phil, right, the budget is the budget's going to be in a tough position. So what I'm wondering is that, given the economy right now, do you see opportunities for revenue measures? Like, will people in the current economy be willing to vote to increase revenues specifically for homeless housing, low-income housing, transit? Like, pick your thing. I'm just kind of wondering, and I don't know historically during economic downturns how these. So I'm curious. I'm sure everyone's thought about this.
Yeah, I think, again, I hate to keep saying this, but I think it's true. It's probably too soon to say. Last November, revenue and bond measures around California did not have their best performance ever. Quite a few were defeated. We still have the 2/3 requirement for a dedicated tax or a bond other than school bonds. And depending on how the economy plays out over the next 6 to 8 months, you could see there being challenges with tax increases. The split roll is, I think they got all their signatures. I hope they did. It's hard to get signatures right now when people are sheltering in place. But that's an important one that I think is still a hard fight. So I think it's too soon to say with revenue. I do think there are opportunities for infrastructure bonds that could include affordable housing. I earlier today became very public about my view that we should go to the ballot with a statewide bond this year, and we should go big on our various needs. There was already a desire, I think, to have a climate resiliency bond in November. I think we should expand it, because the legislature cannot engage in deficit spending to stimulate the economy and invest in infrastructure the way that Congress can. One of our few tools is a bond, and there are pros and cons to doing that. But I think it's a way to inject money into the economy, get people to work, and to address some of our huge infrastructure needs, including housing. And interest rates are so low now. Now is the time to borrow money, and I hope that we will do that. But the general fund is, as Phil knows better than any of us, is going to be not a fund process this year. So there are going to be limits in the general fund.
I was just going to jump in. I totally agree with Scott. I think that this year the budget's going to be very, very challenging, especially given just the uncertainty. We have just no idea how long this is going to go on for. We don't know, even once we come out of staying at home, whether we have to go back home at some point. It seems like things won't get back to some normalcy until we have a vaccine. I think it's going to be hard to do a revenue measure. Just the mood with the voters was already bad. I think they're going to feel even stingier come this November and even going into next year. I do think there could be some opportunities around bonds. I think our big challenge is we have so many small businesses, we have so many lower wage workers who are already on the brink of financial disaster, and this pandemic could just push them over the edge. So the federal government did some help with stimulus. They are helping out with our unemployment insurance. And the question is there stuff that we can do more to sort of keep people from going over that cliff? And that's something that we're going to be grappling with in the next few months. But anything that we can do will mean less money that we have to outlay for CalWORKs, Medi-Cal, all the various social service programs. So the state's going to have to pay one way or the other. It's just really a matter of how we are going to do it. Can we be maybe a little bit proactive before people totally fall over that cliff and help people out with the debts? Right now, people are incurring debt because they're not getting income. So whether you're a business incurring debt or whether you're an individual who's laid off or out of work incurring debt, you're incurring debt. So it's just something that we can do to help people financially with that before it gets to really a disastrous situation.
I would add to the conversation I mentioned before that we've had this housing tax policy involving the mortgage interest deduction. Billions and billions of dollars. If you Google mortgage interest deduction economists across the political spectrum will tell you that it has not incented the home ownership that it was meant to do, and it effectively has been a tax break for wealthier individuals to subsidize housing and actually increase the price of housing. And I think we should trim the worst excesses of that, which would mean hundreds of millions of dollars that we could then spend to invest in housing for homeless individuals or affordable housing. And these are tough choices. If we were in a different time, these conversations might be more difficult, but we will not have general fund dollars to be able to spend. And we've got to think about the monies that we are already spending through tax break policies and others to address this. I do think we should have a serious conversation about additional revenue and additional revenue bonds around affordable housing. Last week, thanks to support of my colleagues on this call and others, we passed our bill that would allow the Bay Area as a region for the first time to control a little bit of our own destiny when it comes to considering revenue measures for affordable housing. We've never done that as a Bay Area region. And the latest thing is to contemplate moving forward with a potential measure on the November 2020 ballot, focused on the most intense needs in the Bay, possibly likely a bond measure, because we know that has a bit more support than others. But I do think that residents understand just how important it is for us to ensure that everyone has a roof over their heads. And we'll obviously see in the coming months how the conversation goes, but we need every aspect of society to step up to help not just decimate from a healthcare standpoint, but then kick people out of their homes, exacerbate our homelessness situation, and shut down housing production such that we're in a much deeper hole in a couple of months or a couple of years.
Thank you. So one more question, then I'm going to go to the audience questions. So Phil, you have a bill proposed that's been getting some attention recently, Assembly Bill 828. And we at the Housing Action Coalition I know it's getting some attention because we're starting to get some questions about it. And so one of the things that I have learned over the years of kind of, as I've worked with authors of legislation and specific legislation, that it's often great to speak to the actual author of the legislation to get the facts about the bill and not necessarily what people perceive it to be. So I was wondering if you would be willing to just take a couple of minutes to talk about 828, what your hopes are with it, the intent, and kind of where it is in the process.
Happy to. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Todd. Really appreciate it. So AB 828 is a bill that we are trying to ensure that we don't have mass evictions. We don't want the homelessness situation to skyrocket. We are worried that we're going to have mass evictions. Without people paying rent, you're going to have mass foreclosures. And so we're trying to really forestall both. And so it's a eviction and foreclosure moratorium during the state of emergency. It's only for the state of emergency. It lasts 15 days after the state of emergency is declared over. What it does is also ask that if you go to court, that a judge then tries to work out with the landlord and the tenant a repayment plan. Because again, the last thing you have after the state of emergency is a chunk of cash ready to pay back all the back rent. And so in terms of distinctions, we try to have a distinction between the small property owners and the larger property owners. So for people who own 1 to 2 units, we assume that there is a material hardship for that particular landlord. And therefore, we don't ask the judge for a particular payment program. For property owners who own between 3 to 9 units, we are agnostic about whether it's a hardship or not. It's really up to the judge to kind of figure that out and then to fashion a payment plan. For property owners who own more than 10 units, we assume that it is not a financial hardship. Now, of course, the property owner could put forward a financial hardship and then bring that forward to the judge to have that as a discussion. The end of the day is this bill is in the very beginnings of discussion. So we have had a lot of chatter. I think there was some misinformation out there that was put out. And we want to make sure that, again, going back, look at the bill, look at how it's constructed, but also help us be part of the solution. I know people have said, hey, why don't we just shelve the bill? Well, if that's fine, we could shelve the bill, but then we could have literally millions of evictions and we could have millions of foreclosures. So again, shelving the bill doesn't do anything to go address what the issue is. Again, I know that especially in San Francisco, we're all concerned about this issue. I'm very open to hearing different solutions. But again, the way the bill was constructed was it was eviction and foreclosure moratorium bill that was taking place only during the state of emergency. It was not a blanket bill for every type of housing and also going on into perpetuity. So again, we know that if we just open up to discussion on one bill, could take the whole panel, which I don't think is the best use of time, but we are, again, engaging stakeholders. Feel free to reach out to my office, email us, call us. Todd can put out our phone number as well as our email so that it's anybody can engage. We've already gotten a lot of feedback on it. But again, even if you don't like the solution, help us craft another solution. Because the end of the day is none of us benefits from putting hundreds of thousands of more people onto the streets and exacerbating this homeless problem. So really appreciate that question, Todd. Thank you.
Yeah, we will certainly. Scott?
Yeah, if I could, and I'm a co-author of the bill. I believe David is as well, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm a co-author of the bill, so I've also been getting quite a bit of feedback, and thank you to everyone for the feedback, and I mean that seriously. I want to just emphasize what Phil said, that this, you introduce a bill and it goes through a process, and the reason why you put it out there publicly is to welcome the feedback, and I think we're trying to make sure we're treating everyone fairly. And I think it's also important to understand that this bill doesn't even come into play unless a landlord and tenant can't work it out on their own. My take is that a large majority of landlords and tenants are going to work it out on their own, come out of the emergency, the renter owes multiple months of back rent. Landlords overwhelmingly are going to want to keep their tenants. They're not going to want to, especially in an economic downturn, have to start finding new renters. So there's an incentive on both sides to try to work it out and to come up with a plan financially to allow everyone to succeed. But if there isn't an agreement, again, we don't want to have when we start coming back up for air, we want to get people up on their feet as quickly as possible. We want people, to return to work. We want businesses to reopen. We want people to be able to stabilize. And if you have people, a large number of evictions, but people just can't pay the back rent, that's not healthy for anyone. It's not good for the renters. It's not good for the landlords. It's not good for society. And so we're trying to come up with a structure, and under Phil's leadership, to make sure that doesn't happen. And so it's important for people to understand this is early in the process. And I've also, people come to me and said, oh my God, there's a permanent 25% reduction in rent, which is not even close to true. So I look forward to, under Phil's leadership, working with folks in this.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna move to questions from the audience, and I'm just gonna apologize to the audience in advance. There's no way we're gonna be able to get to all the questions, but we commit to forwarding whichever questions we can't get to the members, and that when we get responses, we will forward them on also. So from Bobak, I'm hearing some municipalities or counties are filing lawsuits or otherwise pursuing obstructionist policies to prevent our homeless neighbors from being housed in hotel rooms. What can the legislature do to streamline the process behind Project Room Key, as well as further streamline the approval process for subsidized housing and homeless facilities like navigation centers? David, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Bobek, I'm not exactly sure of the specific lawsuits that you're referring to, but the general idea that there are way too many cities in California that have no interest in building any housing structures for homeless individuals, that is, it's a truism. And one of the major topics that we were going to tackle this year, and I think still will likely tackle this year, is this idea of holding jurisdictions accountable for citing homeless shelters, navigation centers, permanent supportive housing, and other housing opportunities for folks who are homeless and otherwise. And I think this could come in a number of forms, whether it be, if the city wants funding, kind of what requirements are we going to ask of cities to do that. I had put forth a bill idea that's building on work of Governor Newsom's statewide task force about stronger levels of accountability. We've had, for example, a judge in Orange County in LA, a federal district court judge, who received the lawsuits filed by homeless advocates against the enforcement of quality of life offenses against these individuals. And what the judge, Judge David Carter, has done with those lawsuits is he has forced cities and counties with homeless advocates, with social service providers, to sit at the table and literally cite where housing is going to be and what services are going to go, as a way to just force all the parties to do work together. That really isn't happening. And cutting through the bureaucratic clutter of city, county, states, regional bodies, making sure that funding is actually used and used efficiently, effectively, and smartly, because we know there's an awful lot of money that's gone out and we haven't exactly seen the outcomes that we want. These are all conversations that are in a whole slew of bills that are going through my committee and going through Scott Wiener's committee. And I expect there to be a real conversation around accountability and streamlining when it comes to providing home and shelter for homeless individuals.
So it's important to understand that a lot of work has gone into this already. And right now in the state of California, any housing up to 80% of area median income, affordable housing, as well as supportive housing, is streamlined in the state of California. I authored Senate Bill 35, which right now is streamlining any affordable housing, including supportive housing, up to 80% of AMI in about 97% of the cities in the state of California, everything other than a few small cities. David passed legislation to specifically streamline supportive housing everywhere permanently in the state of California. Last year, I authored Senate Bill 48 to streamline navigation centers everywhere in the state of California. We were able to pass that as part of the budget, and cities starting last year started taking advantage of that new tool. So right now we have enormous streamlining around homeless housing and navigation centers. This year I'm authoring Senate Bill 1138, which clamps down on the housing element process to make sure, because right now when cities do their housing element, they have to designate a zone where you can put in a homeless shelter as of right. You don't have to go through any kind of discretionary or conditional use process because it is so hard to site them. Cities, unfortunately, have been locating those shelter areas in remote industrial zones or areas where you would never put a homeless shelter. So we're going to change the housing element law to ensure that those by right housing or homeless shelter zones are in appropriate areas. So there's a lot of work that has happened, a lot of work that is happening, and I feel good about the direction that we're going. In terms of the specific program, state program, from the governor to rent or even acquire hotel and motel rooms for homeless people, I think right now it is streamlined. I think the governor is and the administration, they're just leasing out these rooms and helping homeless people to transition there so they can be safe and healthy, and that's happening. And I think there are some cities, particularly in Southern California, that are pushing back. I think they look horrible for doing that. They're going to lose the political fight on that, and I'm confident that they're going to lose the court fight on that. And I know that the administration will keep moving forward with this important program.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there's not much they can do to stop everybody from being put initially into the hotels. I think what's going to be interesting is they'll probably challenge, as people stay there longer, the desire, if we come up with the funding, to make it more permanent. And so I think that's going to be the big question, is whether or not we continue to house people permanently in these hotels, like I mentioned, San Jose started doing, which is to buy hotels and to use that as permanent shelter. So I think that's going to be the bigger question.
Thank you. So next question. This is from San Francisco Housing Action Coalition board member Chris Roach. The COVID-19 pandemic has catalyzed a high degree of experimentation or the widespread relaxation of codes and regulations that have allowed the rapid response we need. Could these regulatory workarounds or other ideas be extended beyond this immediate crisis to address the slow-moving affordability and displacement crisis that preceded it?
I hope so. We have a lot of areas around housing and other areas. Like we were working for years to try to streamline the CalFresh application process, which is horrible in California. You can't even apply by phone. And so we have a low CalFresh uptake rate. And trying to streamline it, we've been hitting wall after wall after wall. All of a sudden, COVID-19 comes around, and boom, by executive order, we have streamlining. So we need to, and now we're going to try to make that permanent by legislation. So I think what COVID-19 has shown, with all of the nightmarish consequences of this pandemic and the death that it's causing and the economic destruction, we're seeing what's possible, that if we want to move fast, if we want to try new things, if we want to set aside unnecessary regulations that we actually don't need, that we know how to do that and we know how to do things quickly. I do hope that in terms of construction of housing, we can also learn from this. Unfortunately, we've had some, in the Bay Area, some of the rules around construction of housing have been way too restrictive. The Bay Area health officers, God bless them, they're heroes in the work that they have done in this pandemic. They put some restrictions on housing construction that I think went a little bit too far. And so we've been working with them, and hopefully that will change. But putting that aside, I think that there are things that we can learn from how things are working during the pandemic, particularly in terms of streamlining. The governor issued some executive orders on CEQA streamlining with projects relating to the pandemic. We should be expanding those because, yes, building a new health facility during a pandemic, critically important. Let's do it as fast as possible. But even without the pandemic, building new housing when we have so many people struggling is also incredibly important and should be accelerated and prioritized.
I think there's definitely an opportunity. Oh, sorry. Go, David.
I would that. You know, as Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's former chief of staff, used to say, "Don't let the crisis go to waste." And we have certainly seen bureaucratic rules, process, delay things, and we don't have time for that right now. You know, on the one hand, I don't think any of us would say that if there are rules that would jeopardize public safety or exacerbate our environment, that those are things that should be lifted. But on the other hand, we know that there are plenty of rules that are on the books that exist literally as rules that don't move forward sort of core values and simply have been used as weaponized by folks to block projects and to slow down the production of desperately needed housing. And I think we've got to look at everything right now with an eye to how do we put a roof over someone's head? How do we do this safely? And how do we do it as inexpensively as we can because we don't have the resources for it, and move forward that way. So certainly we'll be learning a lot in the coming months about what's working, and I do hope we'll continue with things that are.
I think there's definitely opportunity this year to do even more streamlining. I have a bill that I'm introducing to rezone parking lots to make it easier to do residential development. I passed a bill a number of years ago for specific cities that could declare a state of emergency, help relax building codes for both shelters and navigation centers. And we're looking at doing broader work on that this year. So I think there definitely is an opportunity because, again, time is everything. We saw, you know, one day made a difference, 1 week made a difference around this virus. So there definitely is a sense of urgency, and we know that we can't just say, oh, we'll get to it next year. Next year, we know it'll be way too late. And for once, I think there's a feeling that even tomorrow could be too late. So hopefully, taking that sense of urgency, we'll be able to take a look at more streamlining and take a look at very specifically more opportunities to sort of relax some of these codes so we can build faster.
Yeah, so this is almost like a follow-up question from the audience. It didn't happen to be just the way that it came in. I think it fits in really well now. So Jeremy in the audience basically saying that considering, you know, all the health considerations that are going into to the issue that's coming up around housing and lack of housing for, you know, for people, that is there any potential for a type of state of emergency for by right housing that would follow all the local rules on the books for both affordable and market rate housing?
I mean, certainly, I think the governor, you know, could do that. He's issuing a lot of executive orders. I think we should just legislate it. With SB 35, we legislated it for quite a few projects, but we need to expand that. And in my view, if a city has set the rules, this is the zoning, these are the objective design standards, this is the height, this is the density, here are the setbacks, here are all the rules. And if someone comes forward and says, I have a project that fits all your rules, that project should just be ministerially approved. And we're getting there with SB 35 and also the enhancements to the Housing Accountability Act that make it clear that it's illegal to deny a project where you comply with all the local rules. But we need to make it more comprehensive, because if you set the rules and someone wants to do something that fits within all of the rules and standards you set, that you shouldn't be able to put someone through a multi-year, unpredictable, expensive process. It just is unfair. It's one of the reasons we have a housing crisis.
Okay, thank you. So John Lasofsky asks, and this is a follow-up to what David was saying earlier, so to what extent is large-scale development, office and housing, to what extent is that in and of itself the permanent revenue source that Assemblymember Chiu is talking about, both for homeless specifically and local government generally?
I'm a little puzzled by the question, Todd. I wasn't. Can you repeat the first part of that question? Because what I was talking about.
So, David, I think what he's asking is like
not
to the fees that the government receives on office building and market rate housing, how much could that be the sustainable source of revenue of what you were saying you were looking for? That's the way I'm reading the question.
Office development.
Office and, he said office and housing. Both.
Well, I would say when it comes to residential fees, we were actually, before coronavirus, having a conversation around impact fees, because the perspective, and there have been numerous studies that show that cities have tried to squeeze all sorts of fees and exact them on the cost, on the future cost of housing, in ways that are really disproportionate to what it may actually cost the city to do or provide something. And so there was a package of bills to really start to look at the impact fee conversation. Now, in the wake of coronavirus, we've got to figure out what would make sense at this point. But I think to the question, no one has really been looking at the commercial conversation isn't one that I've heard of at this point in the legislature. I don't know, Scott or Phil, if you guys heard differently, but that's why I wasn't, the question was a little out of context for me.
I just think relative to what David was talking about, the fees aren't going to bring in the kind of money that reforming Prop 13 or reforming the mortgage interest deduction would bring in. I mean, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars that are being generated statewide or could be generated. So I don't think you're going to get that kind of money from fees. And like David said, if you increase fees, you're actually providing a disincentive to build office or housing, which I think is really going the wrong direction.
But there is a permanent source in that when new housing is built, it's paying property taxes forever. And it starts out at market rate property taxes, and then it is perpetual. So you have the one time with the fees, which I agree are too high in many cities, including San Francisco, and the transfer tax, but then that permanent year after year after year source of just plain old property taxes.
So I think the answer to the question that I'm about to read is Reform Prop 13, but if you have a different answer, I would love to hear it. So from Adam, says cities are going to be desperate to increase their revenue. One more stable revenue source is property tax. What can the state do to help cities regrow their tax bases while countering the perverse incentives that have been fueling California's jobs, housing imbalance?
Prop 13, baby.
Okay, that's what I figured. Just
yes, you answered your own question.
There you go. Okay, just want to throw it out there. All right, from Stephanie in the audience. So Stephanie is thinking about ramping up homeless and affordable housing. What if anything is the governor or legislature considering in order to reduce the impact of NIMBYism as a barrier to actually building that housing? When we have the funds, are you considering any emergency action that would reduce the ability of local governments to block new housing or incentivize local governments to allow more housing on the flip side, at least during the emergency, if not on a more permanent basis?
Well, that's the work. I mean, we talked about this a little earlier. That's the work we've been doing for years. Various pieces of legislation that I mentioned to streamline all sorts of housing, ranging from market rate down to or market rate, affordable housing, supportive housing, navigation centers. That's streamlined in many cases, and for lower income housing in all cases. We have really beefed up the Housing Accountability Act, passed in 1982. It's referred to as the anti-NIMBY law. It lacked teeth. In the last few years, we put teeth into it so that cities have to comply with their own objective rules. So those anti-NIMBY or anti-obstructionist laws have been passed. There's more work to do, and some of that work is happening now, but it's been happening. We're seeing some of the results, that there are projects that a few years ago never would have been able to move forward that are moving forward. You have some cities that fight tooth and nail, and they sue, like a Huntington Beach, or they'll file lawsuits against the state saying these laws are somehow unconstitutional, which is not the case, but that's working through the courts. But you have a lot of cities, frankly, that'll say, oh, good, you've now, you've told us we have to streamline, now we can avoid a 3 or 5 or 7 year process, and you have cities that are embracing this streamlining and are quickly moving projects through. So there's still more work to do, but a lot has been done.
I'll just jump in by saying on the Assembly side, also many bills that are literally awaiting us right now to make it easier to get housing entitled. So I mentioned, thinking about best practices when it comes to impact fees. There are a number of bills, including one of mine, to help make CEQA infill exemptions work better. Other bills to help streamline smaller projects, reduce parking requirements. Other bills to make density bonus policies work better. Lots of different pieces that we would like to move forward, and as soon as we're reconvening, I expect a number of those to move.
If I could put a pitch, 2 bills that we're moving this year of pertinence to that question. One is Senate Bill 899, which allows for churches, other religious institutions, nonprofit hospitals, if they want to build 100% affordable housing on their property, for example, a church that doesn't need its whole parking lot or whatever, the bill will allow that to be built as of right. Because right now you have a lot of, especially churches that might have declining congregations, and they want to be able to build affordable housing, and they can't under the local rules. SB 899 will allow them to do that. And then SB 902, which will allow 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings throughout California, depending on the size of the city, and will then give cities the tool, if they want to, which I think many will, to zone up to 10 units per parcel without having to go through a CEQA process. Just a quick, with no EIR, they can just rezone an area for 6 or 8 or 10 units per parcel if they choose, and they can do that quickly, no CEQA.
And I think my bill, AB 2943, is a companion bill to the church parking lot bill, where parking lots would get zoned for local development as long as there's 20% affordability. And so this opportunity, as we had been talking about earlier, is an opportunity to increase the amount of streamlining all across the state. I don't think we should be thinking about this only during this particular crisis, but really an opportunity to continue the agenda that we've already been pushing for the last couple of years, to continue to make it easier to build all sorts of housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, all up in, homeless shelters, navigation centers, all up and down the state.
And so for those of us who are like Sacramento legislation nerds, like what's going to be the shift in the calendar, right? Where obviously calendar is going to have to move, so that bills have to move out of houses. So has that been decided yet as to what the new calendars are, what this year's calendar is going to look like for dates for bills to move out of houses?
It's all a function of the curve. At this point, we are tentatively slated to go back on May 4th, and there's a chance that may happen, a real chance that may happen, but it really depends on what happens in the coming weeks, particularly to the decisions made around shelter-in-place orders. I think what it means is whatever the legislative calendar is left, we're going to unfortunately just have much less time to get things through. So part of what we're doing as committee chairs, we're really looking at the bills that are on our dockets to figure out what are the most important things. And basically the standard that every committee is using is it going to help us respond to the coronavirus crisis? And absolutely have to get done in this calendar year. And if it meets those tests, so I'm just mentioning that for everyone who's thinking about different bill ideas you have or you're supporting. If it meets those tests, it has a fighting chance of moving through. I suspect that means many bills introduced this year, including many of our own, will not move forward.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, just to note, Todd, we have no flexibility on the end date, which is August 31st. So that cannot change. So everything, all the bills turn into a pumpkin that date. So with the shorter timeline, we're under an immense amount of pressure to get the work done sooner. It just means we'll be able to hear less bills. I think the big challenge is we're also going to have fewer committee hearings. Normally David or Scott, they might have, a weekly committee hearing, and they're not going to be able to do that just because of logistics and because of just space. So that's going to be another big challenge.
Yeah, it'll be a condensed, very fast process this year, and it will be fewer bills. We have been asked in the Senate to just reduce bills, and I want to add to what David said. For us, yes, obviously anything that's explicitly COVID related or super time sensitive, but we've also I think as a caucus talked about that there are just certain issues that are not COVID related, and the world won't end if they don't pass this year, but are so important for the future of California, certain subject areas that we need to continue to address them. Housing, homelessness, mental health, addiction, wildfires. These are just pressing issues in California that, I don't think we need to set aside just, because we're in a pandemic. We need to address the pandemic and also these previous terrible problems that we've been facing. In my committee, the committee that I chair, the Senate Housing Committee, we had, I think, about 35 or 40 bills that have been referred to that committee. And I was not heavy-handed with authors at all, but we checked in all the authors, and people sort of self-edited and prioritized, and we're down to probably 15 to 16 bills in the Senate Housing Committee, which we, will do in 1 or 2 hearings. So we're still going to be able to pass, I think, great legislation here. It's actually, in some ways, important bills might have a better chance of passing this year, because instead of having thousands of bills floating around where you can, it's so easy to get lost in the shuffle, we're all sort of very focused on what are the things that we really, really want to get done this year. And that in some ways increases their odds.
I skipped over the very first question that was asked. I kind of, as you go down, is probably one that's on a lot of people's minds. So Kimberly Adams asked, will SB 50 rise again, Senator Wiener? So I was just curious. Yeah.
So SB 50 is no longer with us. It is, it's being, it's there for posterity. But there, the president of the Senate, the president pro tem, Senator Atkins, has made crystal clear that housing production is still a priority this year. She has announced that she is working on a housing production bill. There will be other housing production bills as well. I mentioned a few I'm working on. There are others pending in the Senate. There are housing production bills pending in the Assembly. Some of them relate to zoning. I mentioned 2, SB 899, SB 902, that relate to zoning. I know that Phil mentioned the zoning bill that he's working on. Richard Bloom, the Assembly member from Santa Monica, has several zoning reform bills. We have 2 bills, one by Lorena Gonzalez, Assembly member from San Diego, and one from Senator Nancy Skinner that make the affordable housing density bonus more robust, which is a zoning bill. So it is incredible that we have this growing group of members who, and not just from the Bay Area, also from Southern California, who are working on aggressive pro-housing production bills, on zoning reform bills, because zoning is, in many ways, it's so foundational about how much housing is legal to build or illegal to build. And so I am optimistic that we'll be able to get some good things done.
Okay, sounds good. Milo asks, and this is the second time today that someone raised this question with me, is that, so last week, the Judicial Council of California issued several emergency rules for the pandemic, including an extension of deadlines for filing civil actions until 90 days after the current state of emergency ends, which applies to CEQA lawsuits. Have you heard from home builders about this new indefinite uncertainty? Is there anything the legislature can do to remedy it? Phil?
Sorry, yeah, I actually haven't been up to speed on it. So that's the first time, and I haven't heard from homeowners given their concerns. So maybe David or Scott, maybe they've heard, but I haven't. That's the first time.
The Judicial Council actually did an amazing job when it came to kind of eviction moratoriums, putting aside the secret question, but there have been a lot of lack of clarity after Governor Newsom's 2 initial executive orders about whether evictions could occur. And essentially what the governor had done was to say you couldn't enforce the final order of an eviction, but the eviction lawsuits themselves could proceed during this time period. And the Judicial Council in the meeting that we're talking about laid down the law and said, actually, you could file a lawsuit, but nothing can happen after the filing of an eviction lawsuit, which is much more of an effective eviction moratorium. Now, I have started to hear about this CEQA angle, which is a little interesting because my understanding is that there might be some tolling of dates when it comes to the period of time for lawsuits, and I think we should have a conversation about it because I don't think the intent of allowing clocks to run, to me, that's a very different proposition than whether someone is going to get kicked out on the street. But obviously these are complicated. The courts have said what they're going to say, and we're not yet back in session. But for those who are interested in, again, feel free to, for all these topics, feel free to reach out to our offices individually and give us feedback on as far as the impact of different orders.
I think one of the real wild cards here on some of these moratoria or extensions, there's been a deadline, like the governor's eviction moratorium, I think expired May 31st. But for any of the orders from the Judicial Council or the governor or mayors that are in effect until the end of the state of emergency, we don't know when the state of emergency is going to end. And I think a lot of times people, I think, are thinking of the state of emergency as a few months. Maybe by May or June it'll be over. Well, we know that even if shelter in place starts to ratchet down in early to mid-May, which I don't know if it will, but it may, even if it starts to ratchet down then, and we start to inch towards normality, we know that this virus, until there's a vaccine or some miracle treatment, is going to be part of our existence, and we're going to be doing, a very, sometimes very ugly dance with this virus, a lot of give and take in terms of where we are, and so I don't know if the state of emergency lasts until the vaccine is in place, or if it's over in a few months, or if it's over at the end of the year, or if it ends and then starts again if we have a flare up over the winter. So that is a major wild card, and that does create a role definitely for the legislature, because it's not like the state of emergency ends by the time we go back in session. It's probably going to be with us, and so we're going to legislatively be part of that solution.
Yeah, I mean, this was raised today at the Housing Action Coalition board meeting. It was the first I heard of it, and so we're doing some research into it also to see exactly what's happening. But I get the feeling it's going to come up as an issue. So one member in the audience thinks that Prop 13 reform is a non-starter, and that they think that they want to know that, or they are positing that one of the things that has to get done in order to address a lot of the issues we're talking about is CEQA reform. And so just curious, so they want to know, how real do you feel the possibility is of CEQA reform in Sacramento?
Well, that's, every time we say streamlining, all the legislation we've talked about, where we say streamlining or by right or ministerial, there's various pieces of legislation. That is the ultimate CEQA reform, because when you say that it's by right, ministerial, streamlined, that means there's no CEQA. It's not even an exemption. It's just not considered a project for purposes of CEQA. So when people sometimes suggest there's not been CEQA reform, every time we do streamlining or ministerial by right legislation, there's been quite a bit of it. That is the ultimate CEQA reform. In terms of actually changing CEQA, there are some bills this year to do that. I think they It's unclear if they're going to go to the heart of the matter or be a little bit more around the edges about making the process a little more streamlined. There has been conversation between the building industry and organized labor, the building trades, about agreeing on a wage structure for California. If they're able to reach that agreement, and I think parts of the industry have reached an agreement, it appears, with parts of labor, but I don't know how broad it is. But if that agreement is reached on a broad level, that will open the door, I think, to some potentially positive changes to CEQA. Without that, it becomes extremely hard.
I want to take the first part of that question around Prop 13, and again, appreciate a difference of perspectives on it. But I think, my guess is Phil and Scott would probably agree with me on this. We know that Prop 13 has had many, many negative impacts. In part, it has gutted our revenues in our cities, particularly when it comes to schools. When Prop 13 passed in the 1970s, California was one of the top 10 funded school systems in the country and one of the top 10 performing school systems in the country. Now we are bottom 10, 15 for both. But in addition to that, it's also created all sorts of weird disincentives for cities to focus on residential development as opposed to focusing on commercial development, and in particular, strip mall development and other types of retail that we probably need, the focus needs to be right now on how do we build more housing. Now, around CEQA, there are a number of bills moving through the Assembly, including one of mine, to try to make infill exemptions work, because the infill exemptions are on the books, and the intent is to figure out how to allow for more density in urban areas, but they've never really worked well. And so there are a number of us who are progressive Democrats in the legislature who believe that we can make CEQA work better, particularly around infill exemptions. So I expect that conversation to happen this year.
And I think just around Prop 13, it'll be interesting because cities have now been relying on, since the 70s, sales tax revenue instead of property taxes, like David talked about. And with retail really struggling and having a difficult time selling things, it'll be interesting to see cities are going to struggle with revenue. And so it'll be interesting to see if they start to embrace Prop 13 reform, they start to embrace property tax reform, and maybe they'll see that as a source of revenue. Right now, we get bombarded, and we're going to get bombarded the next couple of years with cities saying they're going broke, counties are going broke. But unfortunately, they really haven't identified a revenue stream that they are for. They may pass local tax measures, but they haven't really talked about the very structural reforms like we had advocates talk about Prop 13. So it'll be really interesting. I think sales taxes are really going to be going down, and with everybody shopping more and more from the internet, that's going to really change how much revenues cities bring in. So, Scott brought it up earlier, streamlining is CEQA reform. It's very hard to pass anything that you call CEQA reform. So we've been successful at passing things that are streamlining, that are sort of much more specific pieces of legislation rather than going after the whole big piece of it. He's totally right. Unless the building trades and the environmentalists can find a deal with the builders, it's almost impossible to do sort of wholesale reform on CEQA.
Okay, thank you. So we are almost at the bottom of almost at the end of our time. I'm going to do one final question. Before we go there, I just wanted to thank the three of you. In San Francisco, I just feel we are so fortunate to be represented by three, really amazing champions in housing and public health and transit and issues. And so thank you so much for the work that the three of you do in Sacramento on our behalf. I also just want to tell the audience that I hope you enjoyed this today. And if you did, please join us tomorrow as we are co-hosting a panel with California YIMBY at 2 o'clock. I'll be peeling back of kind of what happens on lobbying in Sacramento. And so at 2 o'clock, we will be joining with a lobbyist from Lighthouse Communications, Holly Fermini de Jesus. I apologize if I butchered your name, Holly. Sosin Madinat, also apologize, Sosin, if I did that. And Graciela Castillo Krings of Sacramento Advocates. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up on the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition's website at our events tab. And so just want to do that. And then one last question is actually from the Deputy Director of the Housing Action Coalition. If I don't ask it, I'll hear about it all day tomorrow from Corey. So Corey wanted to know what efforts are happening with the state treasurer, controller, or other statewide elected officials to respond to COVID? Or is it mainly the governor and the legislature that's doing, a majority or all of the work around this?
I think the other statewide constitutional officers are all working very hard. For example, the Attorney General has been very active around a number of issues, including, for example, price gouging, and continuing to fight the Trump administration on all the non-COVID-19 atrocities committed by that administration. Our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, is very focused on elections, and of course, we have this, I think, need to make sure that everyone gets an absentee ballot in November, so we don't have anything like what happened in Wisconsin. I know that the controller, Betty Yee, is very, obviously she is very focused on the state's fiscal health. And Fiona Ma, I know David and I just had a call with her a few weeks ago on an affordable housing issue. So, and Ricardo Lara, our insurance commissioner, has been working to make sure that people don't get their insurance policies canceled if they can't get a premium for a few months. And this whole issue of business interruption coverage, which insurance companies are not wanting to pay on for businesses that have had to close down. So the statewide, and Eleni Kounalakis has been very active on like everything. So they're all super active, involved on a lot of the policy issues. The governor, understandably and justifiably, he's the leader. He's getting a lot of attention, as he should. But this is really a group effort in Sacramento.
I think what I would add to that is, a number of these statewide officers have a role when it comes to housing. So whether it be Javier Becerra bringing Housing Accountability Act lawsuits, or Fiona Ma with her ability to control some of the levers around affordable housing financing, everyone is trying to huddle to figure out how do we streamline, how do we work together during the crisis before coronavirus and certainly during coronavirus. But let me just say in closing, just again, appreciate the engagement. I know looks like we had 150 folks, and that's a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer. And I would just suggest, if you have ideas or suggestions, please reach out to us. I'm sure this is the case for Scott and Phil, but many of our best ideas we get from those of you who live and breathe this stuff every day. And you're probably thinking about things and see angles that because we don't have time, or we're not intimately involved in specific aspects of how we build housing, we may not see. So let me encourage you to reach out to us. But let me also say, I think these are not easy conversations, but we work through them, and when we do, is when good things happen, and that's how we all prevail. Thank you, Jack. And as someone who's worked with Phil and Scott for a couple decades, it's been an honor to work with these guys. We're all working around the clock to make it happen, and we will all see each other on the other side of this curve.
Thanks. And just to answer Corey's question, I actually just spoke to Fiona this morning, and she was talking how she's getting up 8 o'clock every day and just working her butt off. One of the things that she's been focused on is all the money that goes to pay all these contracts that the governor talks about, whether it's the ventilators or the hospital beds or the hotels and the motel. She's working with Betty's office to make sure that money moves into the office, the controller actually cuts those checks. Now, in terms of Betty, she's got incredible oversight over all the contracts that the state is getting involved in. And so since we've had to move so fast and do things so quickly and frankly, a little bit unorthodox, I'm sure their offices are extraordinarily busy. But just to piggyback on what David said, just thanks Todd and Corey and the entire HAC board for organizing this great forum. Town Hall always reminds me of why I feel so fortunate to be coming from San Francisco, have the honor to represent part of San Francisco and Sacramento. I know the three of us all feel that way with all these incredible questions and this great dialogue. And just to reiterate what David said, we always appreciate all the feedback, the good, the bad, the neutral, and all the ideas, because so much of our thinking is driven by our experience here, what we learn from here, and with so many of the different stakeholders who've help educate us along the way. It's not, legislation doesn't really matter unless it's something that we put into practice in real life. And your coalition is really all everyday practitioners who are looking at how to build housing every single day. So if they can't use this to their benefit to build more housing, ultimately that's a sign of failure on our end. So that's why it's so critical when we get your feedback that we try to put it in practice. So really appreciate that. Thanks again for inviting all of us to address this group.
Really appreciate it. To Scott, David, and Phil, please stay safe, stay healthy. Same to the audience members, and really appreciate everyone who participated. We'll get through this. This is, as my mom would say, this too shall pass. So anyway, take care, everyone.